My name's Dominic Ackland, and I'm part of the project team here for Connecting the Culm. And this event is really got two halves to it. One half is looking at the risks that the future holds for us with the extreme effects of climate change if we don't take action. And the other half is looking to the future and a more resilient future and how we can create that working together. And we've got two speakers who are going to be reflecting those two sides of the event. Dr. Freya Garry from the Met Office is an expert in climate risks, and she'll be speaking first. And then Rob Hopkins from Transition Totnes and author of What If will be stimulating our imaginations about how we can create a more positive future. So this is the two sides of the same coin, really, of adaptation to climate change. And this quote from Sir James Bevan, who's Chief Executive of the Environment Agency, is sort of goes right to the point. The point is not just to survive. If we adapt right, we can thrive too. That's because climate adaptation offers all of us a world of new opportunities. The most exciting opportunity of all is the opportunity to create a better world. Now, just quick briefing on the Co-Adapt, on the Connecting the Culm project. It's part of an Interreg program called Co-Adapt, working with partners across in the West Country and also across the Channel, all looking at similar questions of adaptation to climate change, working with communities and nature-based solutions. So Co-Adapt has these three pillars of working collaboratively across communities to develop solutions, long-term solutions, using nature, working with natural processes, and adapting to climate change. And we, of course, are working on this blueprint for the Culm, which will be a long-term vision and delivery plan for the catchment. And just for those who perhaps don't live in the area who are joining us this afternoon, this is the Culm catchment which joins the Exe just north of Exeter at the bottom of this picture, and then runs up through its largest town is Culm, up to the headwaters in the Blackdown Hills, area of outstanding natural beauty up in this area. And also a significant part of the catchment is runs parallel with the M5 and the Grand Western Canal. And these are some of our funding partners and agencies helping deliver the program. So I'm going to stop sharing there. And I have one more task to do, which is to run the first of two polls. And if you could kindly, when I bring up these poll questions, just answer the questions on there. It gives us a snapshot of where we are at the beginning of the tonight's meeting event, and then we'll run the same poll at the end. So if I could just ask you to answer these two questions, that would be very good. One is about how much you feel you know about climate change already. And the other is how much you feel you can get involved in tackling climate change impacts.
Not allowing me to submit.
Oh, that's frustrating.
Have you done both questions? Because I realised that I hadn't done the second question and then it worked.
Thanks, Emily. Did you have to scroll down to see the other question? Yeah, okay, thanks.
We've had 79% of people have voted. Oh, it's up to 81. We're getting there. We're getting there. Great. I'm going to call a halt there because 87% have voted. An interesting spread there. Thank you. We'll share the results at the end. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Freya Garry of the Met Office. Freya, the screen is yours.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. So I work at the Met Office in a team in applied science, which is focused on UK climate resilience. And I've recently done a piece of work focusing on agriculture in the UK specifically, which obviously due to the area that we're in is something that we're quite interested in down here. So just a little bit of a personal background. I'm not from a farming family, but I did grow up in quite rural locations in Cumbria and the Isle of Man. And now I live quite close to the Culm catchment. I actually live down in South Devon, so I'm a bit nearer the sea. And I ended up through studying oceanography, becoming a climate scientist, and that's how I've become a climate impacts researcher. And the work that I'm doing at the moment is funded under a big project across the UK called the UK Climate Resilience Programme. So lots of different institutes and universities are involved in this programme, which is trying to bring together all those little bits of research going on into a more comprehensive programme, building those networks between everyone working on these problems and going more towards how that we can get that research out into climate services as well, so that it's really benefiting society. So you may well be quite familiar with something like this that shows how the global average temperature is changing over the last 200 years. So this is a graphic that we've done at the Met Office to show that. So I won't dwell too much on that, but it's a sort of obvious starting point. And a colleague of mine has done these really nice graphics about how the fossil fuel emissions that drive that temperature change have changed recently, and how much the sort of percentage of fossil fuel emissions that have been emitted have occurred in each of our lifetimes. So I'm just over 30, so that's more than 50% in my lifetime. It's just quite a stark way of communicating just how much and how rapidly that carbon has been emitted just even over the last few years. And then the climate stripes as well. So I'm just using these to use Ed Hopkins' climate stripes to bring it here, to talking about England specifically, that we obviously are seeing that trend that we see across the world. You know, we do have quite a well moderated climate from the Atlantic, so it may be that the impacts that we experience here are not as severe as in different parts around the world, but that doesn't mean that we won't still have notable impacts. So here's another graphic that shows some of those impacts that we do expect to see, that probably most of you on the call will be quite familiar with, but just going beyond some of the obvious into things like conflict and climate migrants as well. And you know, everything's a knock-on effect. Impacts will cascade across different sectors of society. So I think sometimes people don't realise just how many impacts temperature change will lead to. So these are the priority areas which the Committee for Climate Change, which is the body that is has a statutory remit in UK law to report on the progress of UK government in tackling climate change. These are the priority areas highlighted in the last climate change risk assessment. And you see how most of those are related in some way here to agriculture, risk of shortages to water, agriculture, soils, food production, pests and diseases. Really key area for the UK. And as we know, climate change is here today, but when these the progress of different sectors is assessed by the Committee for Climate Change, agriculture here, less progress than a lot of sectors, lower quality of plan for a lot of sectors. So if you look at the CCC reports, there's some really, really useful information there about how people are preparing for the risks that we're going to face. So in the Met Office, we have helped develop a new set of climate projections in recent years, so based on climate models, but quite high resolution, really co-developed with users to help us look at these climate risk assessments with the sort of ultimate best tools that we have available. And the main messages you might have heard before about from UK climate projections: hotter, drier summers, milder, wetter winters. That is the main message. But that does, that generalization can risk masking the fact that you will have much more intense rainfall is projected when it does come, both in summer and winter. So therefore there is still that risk of flash flooding, even when we say overall the summers may be drier with drought. So both things are projected to happen. And of course, this means that as we go towards 2050, record-breaking summers like 2018 are projected to become much more likely and maybe happen every other year. And extreme winter rainfall, they're 7 times more likely. And this graph on the right shows where the 40-degree Celsius temperature is likely to be hit, basically. So at the moment here, we expect it to only hit that sort of temperature maybe 1 in 100 years. I mean, I'm not sure if that record, I don't think, has actually been broken yet, so it's quite unlikely. But as we go through, we do expect that even by medium to be 1 in 10 year event by the end of the century if we go on a high emission scenario, even more frequent than that. And I think what's really important just to note while we talk about different scenarios is that they don't tend to diverge much until about after 2050, because there is that lag in the climate system. So you hear a lot of people debating this, but it's not going to make much difference over the next 20 to 30 years for the climate change that we see. We're kind of already sort of locked into that. But obviously that doesn't mean that you shouldn't not take it, but it talks about the immediacy for climate action there. Right, so models, simply lots of equations strung together on our supercomputers, and the key things is that when you're thinking about short term, there's a lot of chaos obviously in the weather system. But on longer timescales, the main uncertainty that we're really worried about is just not knowing the scenario that humans are going to pick. It's a sort of a social science problem almost, that we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But the climate models that we've done in the past have actually done a really good job. This paper looks back and see what we thought was going to happen with the black line, and what did actually happen with the red line. And so actually on climate timescales, we've done a really good job of predicting how the climate is changing. And obviously we're constantly trying to improve that. And actually our weather forecasts are very good as well. And a 4-day forecast is as accurate today as the 1-day forecast were in 1980. So we like to remember that, because obviously we do have a lot of changeable weather here and people aren't always happy when it's not what they wanted it to be. So obviously in an ideal world, we'd want a very accurate, high precision climate projection. But obviously, as I've just sort of said, that depends on exactly what we as humans emit. We can't know that exactly. So if we gave a really precise guess about the future, it's probably likely it to be wrong. So what we do is supply a range of possibilities to cover that spread. So it is less precise, but it is likely to be more accurate. So when you often see a range for climate predictions, that's really why we are trying to do the best job we can. So back to UKCP, here's just a little bit more detail about some of this sort of warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers by the end of the century. So I'll just leave that up as 2 seconds, and then if you want to pause it on the recording, you'll be able to later. So we zoom into the Culm, and we've recently created a new tool at the Met Office where we can enter the postcode of any location, and it will match that to the nearest square. So I've taken Culm stock here and have a look at what UK climate projections show. And so it does an estimate of what you'd expect in the current climate for sort of the hottest summer day there, and sort of heat waves, and then for 2 degrees warming and 4 degrees warming. So you can see that there is quite a big difference between 2 degrees warming and 4 degrees warming, both in the extremes there and how long heat waves might be. And then here on the drier summers and extreme rainfall, we can see that as well. So the difference in rainfall projections isn't quite as stark. There's more uncertainty there around that. Whereas the temperature is a very, very clear, large increase. So I've just summarized that in a little table there for you as well. And that's about summers. And then winters here as well. So the warmest winter day actually might not change that much with 2 degrees here in these projections, but 4 degrees shows a bigger increase. And then the rainy days, probably quite similar. Okay, so some of the consequences of that we might be quite familiar with already, but when you've got this very dry ground, obviously it's harder to absorb the water when it does come, so you get that greater risk of flash flooding when the extremes come. Floods more likely in that warmer, wetter winter. And in the winter, you know, when your waterways tend to rise, and they were designed for kind of historical rainfall levels, that might put a lot of pressure. And obviously in this area, we already kind of see that happening sometimes. So a lot of you probably may know a lot more about impacts on UK agriculture on a day-to-day basis. But wheat production has had a hard time in 2020, and the changes to the seasons also seem to be really having big effects. So especially, you know, when you have problematic conditions in both your planting sort of season and your harvesting season. So there's just a note on that, really. Okay, just a word about wildfires here. So another interesting paper on this has come out about in the southwest. So they have estimated that the danger indicators, so obviously a lot of fires actually happen due to a sort of human source, but the conditions kind of were right for that fire to start. So that's the fire danger indicator. So maybe 12 days per year. But rising to around a month a year in the 2050s and even 2 months a year in the 2080s. So that's quite a stark increase, I think. And obviously there's just some pictures and news there of recent fire seasons that we've had in the UK, which have been quite unprecedented. So now I'm just going to have a little bit about the piece of work specifically that I've been looking on over the last year. So actually it's, I've been looking at these events specifically called compound events, and taken a couple of examples from UK agriculture. So these are multivariate events where both two different sort of weather variables that we call them, so humidity and temperature in this case, combine to sort of cause some sort of impact. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. And in this case, we're talking about increased potato blight and increases in heat stress and livestock. And obviously both of those risk reduced yields or productivity. So dairy cattle may, when they experience this high temperature and humidity, may have a range of impacts, reduced weight gain, decreased fertility, milk yield. So obviously in some countries that are a lot hotter than us, they have to kind of moderate this with air-conditioned barns and things like that, which obviously have their own, you know, carbon cost. So here, assuming a lot of our cattle, obviously in the southwest, spends a lot of time outdoors, and we have the most cattle of any region in the UK, so I don't know why it's skipping on its own. So we use this index, which combines the temperature and humidity information into this heat index, and then there's a value at which that heat index would cause the cattle to be stressed. So in this work, on the left-hand side, you can see the current climate. So sorry, I've put London on there because these plots they're presented to an international audience. I'm sure you're all familiar with London. You can see most of the UK, only a very few days per year actually exceeding this threshold in the last 20 years, maybe some more around southeast, but not very much. Whereas in this projections, looking at 2050 to 2070, so 30 to 50 years time, you're seeing much more increase across England, particularly the southeast, but even around where we are, you know, maybe around a month of these conditions. So a month more of the conditions, that's the increase on the right hand side showing those numbers. And so particularly, yeah, in the Culm, heading toward Dorset way. So I've also summarized it in this kind of this table from there, but also the graphic on the right side. So the size of the bars kind of show the relative change in days per year. So it's a really, really big difference in the number of days projected. And there, as I said, in the southwest England, going from sort of 3 days to nearly 30 days. So it's 10 times more. So another thing that we're keen to try and do a little bit more in sort of climate services now is not just thinking about the hazard itself, but really moving towards a more of this risk-based framework. So essentially, risk is this combination of the hazards and the temperature, for example, the vulnerability. So when that temperature becomes an issue to you, and the exposure, so how many of you are affected. So in this case, how many cattle numbers are affected. So and then presenting that as a risk increase. So there's just this graphic showing that as a sort of percentage increase there. So this is a little bit more, when we go back to those plots I showed earlier with the dartboards, and we're thinking about the accuracy and precision. So basically, because there are these uncertainties in the climate model projections, there are a number of different models used in this projection. So the range of the box plot shows the different models. So so when we think about the increase, there it's very clear that there's a big difference between the current and the future, but the exact amount of how much the change in the future might be is, you know, it is not clear. So we provide that range. But really, I think the other key thing to pull out of this plot is that here we're showing that these kind of 15-day long events, sorry. It gets when I think when I touch the table, it bounces on. So these 15-day long events may be happening sort of every 1 in 3 years. So number of days per year, so 5 days per year on average. So that means that a 15-day event may happen every 1 in 3 years. And in fact, over the whole ensemble, so which is the group of models, there are events of up to 43 days long. So this it's really showing that these conditions may happen a lot longer. And the second example here, potato blight. So we project potato blight happens. So we actually provide like a weather forecast for potato blight when the minimum temperature of 10 degrees is exceeded, and a day has at least 6 hours with relative humidity over 90%. So what I did was apply these same conditions to the climate model data to see how often it's projected to happen in the future. So you can see that more potato blight is projected to occur along the west coast, sorry, which makes sense because it's wetter, more humid there. Really sort of Scotland, Wales, so these high topography, they're really showing hotspots, but they might not be the regions where you really grow potatoes. So if I don't know if you know much about potatoes, but actually most of the potatoes are grown in Britain on the east coast. In the east of England and East Scotland. So when we look at the risk increase in these 5 areas where the most potatoes are grown, you can see that it's generally projected to be an increase of these blight conditions 20 to 30% around these east of England areas, but up to 70% in East Scotland. And so what I did as well was compare this to some work that my colleague was doing, Helen Hanlon, was looking at drought indices and how those are projected to change over a similar sort of period. And this drought index of about a sort of 6-month drought was predicted to become a lot more severe along the east coast as well. So that puts this obviously additional strain on that industry. So if you're looking kind of in the northeast, you might have an increase in potato blight, but also an increase in likelihood of drought. Less drought on the northwest, but very large increases in potato blight. And then the southeast, moderate changes in potato blight, but very high drought risk. So maybe the southwest could actually be a little bit of a sweet spot where there's a little bit of an increase in potato blight occurrences, but not too much increase in drought either. And so that's just kind of a little bit of a summary of the work in an infographic form there. And so when this paper was released, we actually had some media coverage, went out in Farmers Weekly. And so here, Farmers Weekly here suggested some of the ways that farmers can manage the risk. Some ideas for nature-based solutions, such as shade for cattle through silvopasture and agroforestry, you know, focusing on different breeds and diversifying potato crops. And then you obviously have these other options around fans, grazing cattle at night and housing them during the day in, you know, and things like air conditioning as well. But also, design of the buildings apparently is also key, with ventilation and ways to control the airflow. And then recently I also saw this. I don't know even if some of you may even be involved in this, but this shows here some local silvopasture there being established, which should just be a really, really nice way to help provide shade to livestock in the future. And just a quick word at the end, there's a lot of other colleagues in the Met Office who do various different bits of work on agriculture as well, on wheat yields, water resource availability, and pests and diseases are some of the key areas. So I just wanted to highlight that there's lots of different work that we do at the Met Office focusing on this area. So I've just put a little couple of slides there with some of the references and places for more information. So obviously when you go back to the recording, you can kind of pause and get these links later, but I won't leave them up for too long now. So thank you very much for listening. So I will pass back to Dom, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Freya. That was deeply fascinating. And I should have said at the beginning that we're going to have a question and answer session at the end, but please do put your questions in the chat now, and we'll pick those up at the end and dig into them. So yes, I think that was a great kind of overview of the climate change situation and the risks, as well as a deep dive into a particular sector, and lots of thoughts, I'm sure, bubbling away from that. And now I'll hand over to Rob to really take a different slant at things. Rob, again, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see you all. Nice to see a few familiar faces out there as well. So yeah, I'm Rob Hopkins from Transition Network. And I want to talk a bit about the role of imagination in all of this, if I may, which is, I feel like in 2021, kind of as Freya said, you know, this is sort of my distillation, I guess. I feel like we are standing on top of a mountain. Beneath our feet is more carbon, more plastic, more debt, more inequality, more anxiety than we've ever stood on top of before. And the people like Freya, who are kind of our Sherpas up this mountain, who know this mountain really well, are pointing to the very dark storm clouds that are moving in on us very, very quickly, and saying we really need to get down off this mountain very, very quickly. And for some of us, That's okay. They're the experts, right? They know the mountain far better than we do, and so we say, okay, right, you are, and then we start designing a way down the mountain. For everybody, that doesn't seem to be working for everybody in anywhere near the level of kind of pace and urgency that it needs to. And maybe alongside the arguments of facts and figures and so on, and rational arguments, we also need to be cultivating longing and talking about a post-carbon future in a way that is capable to do that. Thinking about us in terms of a mountain, what if we were on top of the mountain and instead we were telling people about the valleys that await us when we can get down off the mountain, and the warm welcome that awaits us there, and the warm firesides, and the delicious food, and the dry socks, and the comfortable mattresses that await us when we get there. And then maybe, as well as the work of trying to motivate through facts and figures and analysis, we also need to be bearing in mind the role of imagination and storytelling in terms of really cultivating that longing. When Neil Armstrong went to the moon, that wasn't his idea. It wasn't JFK's idea in 1960. We'd been going to the moon for decades in stories and songs. Frank Sinatra sang us to the moon. Tintin went to the moon. Mickey Mouse probably went to the moon. Everyone, by the time Neil Armstrong got to the moon, everybody had already been there, basically, and cultivated such a rich longing that it meant that when we decided to do it, it was done in just 9 years. And the average age of the team that got them there was 26. So how do we cultivate longing for a low carbon future so that we can come firmly in on those lower case scenarios in what Freya was talking about rather than the higher case? And the human imagination is an extraordinary thing. And I spent the last couple of years kind of really studying it. And my favorite definition of it is that it is the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. And I would say that if there was ever a superpower that we need to cultivate in 2021, it is absolutely the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. How many people at the moment are sitting, for example, in the Ministry of Defence, actively imagining a peaceful world? And how do we get there? How many people in the Department of Justice are actively imagining a world with no prisons and with a very different kind of criminal justice system? You cannot build what you cannot imagine. And one of the beautiful things about the human imagination is that it thrives with limits. So Dr. Seuss, who wrote this book that Green Eggs and Ham, I'm sure many of you read it as children or have read it to your own children or maybe to your grandchildren, will know this book, probably recite great chunks of it without having to think too hard. Dr. Seuss wrote Green Eggs and Ham because his publisher challenged him to write a book that just used 50 words. That was his palette that he had to work with. And he later said it was by far the most kind of the best workout his imagination ever had. The beautiful thing I find, and I get to visit communities doing transition and decarbonizing themselves, relocalizing their agriculture, making it more resilient all across Europe. I don't fly, so it's just places I can reach by train. What I find when people are recognizing and embracing the limits that the science puts on us, they're far more imaginative and innovative and creative than the people who somehow imagine that there aren't any limits. But I worry that in 2021, we're living in a time where of kind of imaginative poverty, and our ability to really think big, bold, and imaginative is kind of being squashed. And Mariame Kaba, who's one of my favorite writers, she said, we live in a system that has been locked into a false sense of inevitability. And there was some amazing research published in 2010 that looked at the state of health of our imagination. It was done in the US, but she found the same pattern in 30 other countries, including the UK, where she looked at the big data set from this creativity test that's been done back to the early 60s in the US. Her conclusion was that IQ and imagination rose together till the mid-90s, at which point IQ kept rising and imagination started to decline and has been declining ever since. And when this was published, it made the front page of Newsweek. People were like, oh, what does this mean for economic growth? What does this mean for Hollywood? But I never heard anybody say, what does this mean for climate justice? What does this mean for our ability to imagine a world that is really able to embrace the challenge of the climate emergency? So this feels really, really important to me. That you know, we recognize that if a population doesn't have a good diet, you're going to see a rise in preventable illness. We recognize if a population doesn't have a good education system, it's going to fail to reach its full potential. But somewhere just over here our collective imagination is kind of shrinking and desiccating at the very worst time possible in history. As Naomi Klein says, there are no non-radical solutions left. We really have to profoundly rethink agriculture in some of the ways that Freya was starting to set out, how we do pretty much everything and the scale on which we do it. So how might we set about cultivating longing for a low carbon future? That's really been what's run through the work I've done for the last 12, 13 years. One way is through art like this. This is a guy called James Mackay at the University of Leeds, who I think of as the man who draws the future. This is his drawing of Leeds. If Leeds became the most biodiverse city in the country, if right now the longing was so acute to do that, that everything was thrown at that, what might it look like in 10 years? And the beauty of a picture like this is that it helps us to almost be able to smell it and to see it and to really feel into, yeah, actually. And the poet Rilke once said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. So what are the smart ways to allow a successfully navigated low carbon future to enter into us? This is another of his drawings where he says in many cities around the world, there's now this real push to remove cars from the city. We know that COVID, people's vulnerability to COVID was made far worse by air pollution. About 40,000 people a year die in this country related to air pollution. How do we start to, what are we going to do with that space? He says, well, fill that space with gardens. Imagine our kids walk to school through places like this. You know, actually, if we could generate the longing for this, doing it would be the easy bit. We could do this in a couple of years. It's not a big deal. But how do we cultivate in our culture and in our narrative a longing for that? One way I think is through animation that helps us to see things in different ways. This is Fleet Street in London. Many of us have been to Fleet Street, walked down Fleet Street. When you walk down a street like this, you kind of assume it's always going to look like this because we have nothing to replace it with. But this is the work of an organization called London National Park City, who say, actually, maybe Fleet Street could be like this. And once you've seen it in that different kind of a way, even though the people on the right-hand side look like they're just about to be flattened by that car coming at them at considerable speed, actually, once we're able to really shift this sense of possibility in our imagination, I think it really, really helps. You might be thinking at this point, well, Rob, Hopkins, that's all very nice. This is all kind of a bit fanciful nonsense. Well, actually, this is starting to happen in many places now around the world. In Barcelona, the municipality in Barcelona just announced they were going to close 30% of all the streets in the center of Barcelona and turn those streets into forests, into places for people to play, to connect, to hang out. You know, once you take back the space from the car, we can either look at that as like we're taking away something, or we could look at it as actually we're creating something, a new opportunity for something new to happen that hasn't been able to happen before. One of the things that I do is I run a podcast series called From What If to What Next. I'll give you a link for that at the end. And in every episode, we explore a different what if question. And we ask the two guests who are exploring that at the beginning, I invite them to step into my time machine and we travel to 2030. Not a 2030 that's a utopia or any kind of paradise, you know, but it's a 2030 that is the result of us doing everything we possibly could have done in these intervening 9 years. And it's often the most beautiful, moving part of the whole thing. I invite them to walk us around through that future. What does it look like and smell like and feel like? And I recently made a series of little animations where I cut together some of my favorite bits of people's observations during that time. And I'm just going to share this one with you. And I'm just wondering now, actually, if I click the share audio button. So I'm going to go off share screen and then go back on it and click share sound so that you'll be able to actually hear it. And then I'm going to show you this, about a minute long, little taste of what 2030 could be like.
We're going to be using re in our language. We're going to be rebuilding, refurbishing, remaking, reusing, recreating, reinventing. The re is going to be a big part of our language.
Police and prisons and the armed forces were massively defunded, and that money has gone into robust preventative health care and well-being programs that also contribute to a rich imagination.
Financial insecurity has been eradicated. People no longer go to work because they have no choice.
And so all these workspaces that used to be occupied by big banks are now, of course, being redirected and used for creative spaces of all sorts, whether it's technical or artistry.
If you see girlfriends meet each other, they won't say, oh, you got this new dress, but they will say, oh, you got the same dress that you wore last week, but now you've made a little change about it. And that's so fancy and that's so fashionable.
So I can give you a link at the end where more of those little videos that we've done. So what I wanted to talk to you about in my time with you is about the power of really good what if questions. So what I mean by a what if question is captured really beautifully by a guy called Antanas Mokas, who used to be the mayor of Bogota, who said, what people love most is when you write on the blackboard a risky first half of a sentence and then recognize their freedom to write the other half. And so I want to share with you a couple of stories of different what if questions. This is in London, in Tooting, where in Tooting there is nowhere that is like a village green or a town square, like a people's place. So the transition group there, Transition Town Tooting, found this place, which is a bus turning circle. It's always full of buses. Their engines are idling, waiting to be called off somewhere else. So they said, that should be our village green. So they did a day that they called the Tooting Twirl. And in the Tooting Twirl, they crowdfunded £2,000, and they turned that space for a day into what it would be like if it actually was the village green. They rolled real grass down onto the street. I was able to sit there on a July afternoon with my feet on the green grass of Tooting. And as that day went by, I heard the conversation shift from, if this was our village green, to when this is our village green. It felt like somewhere deep underneath the kind of tectonic plates of permission started to shift. And I noticed during the day people looking at this wall, which, if there was a contest for London's dullest wall, this may well make the top 3, and saying, when this is our village green, what story of ourselves are we going to paint on that wall? What do we want to, how do we want to present ourselves? What story do we want to tell? So I really got a sense that day that when you frame a what if question in the right way, it can really shift people's sense of what to anticipate and what they might long for. This is Hilary Powell and Dan Edelstein. They live in London and in Walthamstow. And they became very aware of the unfolding debt crisis being driven by austerity in their community, the rise of people using food banks and getting into the worst kind of dangerous debt. And at the same time, the last bank on their high street closed. And so they set about, they took that bank over and turned it into what they called an act of citizen money creation. During the evening, they used it for speakers and films about economics. During the day, they turned it into a printers where they were printing these notes, which you can see hanging up behind them. And these notes are, they're not a local currency. They are like limited edition artworks that were sold in different denominations. And each one celebrated somebody in that community who was kind of catching the people falling because of austerity. For example, Gary on those notes, he was so heartbroken by the level of food poverty that he mortgaged his own house to raise the money to turn his garage into a food bank. These are the kind of heroes in our community who often go uncelebrated. They sold £50,000 worth of these notes. Half of them were used, were shared among these 4 charities. The other half was used to go to the secondary debt market where debt is bought and sold. And they bought £1.2 million worth of Walthamstow-based payday lending debt, the kind of debt that the people in the toughest situation often find themselves in. And they wrote to all those people and said, that debt you had, your debt is cancelled. Have a good life. We don't expect anything in return. But if you'd like to join us at a site overlooking Canary Wharf on the 10th of May, you'd be very welcome. And when people arrived, there was this van painted gold with the words debt in transit written on, filled with bits of paper with the word debt on. And at 10 o'clock that morning, they blew the van up in a controlled explosion. And then everybody who had invested in it got sent, this is my commemorative piece of metal from the van. This is my commemorative piece of the glass from the windscreen. They minted special commemorative coins. It was an extraordinary thing. They could have just started a petition about debt. Actually, they did something that really touched people and was quite an extraordinary thing. And the last one I want to share with you is from Belgium, in Liege, which is an old industrial city there. there's the transition group in Liege started a project called the Liege Food Belt, based around a what if question of what if in a generation's time the majority of food eaten in Liege came from the land closest to Liege. Again, it's a beautiful question. It's like the first half on the blackboard, but it also gives you a taste of a different kind of a future that makes you think, actually, I'd love to see that happen. Yeah. And what role can I play in that? So I went to a big event where they launched this idea and invited everyone in the city who cared about food. I went back 5 years later, and in that time in Liege, they started 25 new cooperatives. They raised 5 million euros of investment from local people, not from the banks. They started a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery, a shop called the Small Producers, which did so well after 6 months. They opened a second and they now have 4. I met the mayor of the city who said, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. This is the story of where we're going. You know, so in Liege, you could really get a sense of that question when you get it right can unlock so much because it's invitational. People step in, they can see their role in it. So one of the things I've loved to see during lockdown is people who have used this idea of what if to shape their conversations about where do we go next. This Sweden, the Green Party, did an advertising campaign where they did much the same thing. They identified the things that were already going well in their city and put up a photograph with the words, what if? Yeah, what if we lived in a society where actually a dad could take his kids to the woods to play for the day without feeling guilty that he's missing his email or not quite being busy enough? What if we lived in cities where everybody played a role in much more edible, multi-purpose landscapes rather than just acres of grass that needed mowing? You know, what could that actually be like? I wanted to just finish off, and then I want to set you a little short exercise, which hopefully we still have. I was invited to Austria a little while ago, and by Patagonia, the clothing company, who are a very sustainable company. They're very sustainable in a lot of what they do, but they were realizing that as a company, they weren't really acting with the sense of urgency that the climate and ecological emergency demands. They were kind of coasting a little bit on their reputation. So they invited me, and I did a couple of days workshop with them, trying to get them thinking differently. And at the end, we did a thing that we called the Walk of What If. And a Walk of What If is, we sent them out into groups of 6. We had an overarching what if question, which was what if Patagonia, in everything that it did, acted as if this was a climate and ecological emergency. And they went out in groups of 6. I said, there are just 2 rules. The first rule is you don't need to be bound by what already exists. Don't worry about the 5-year plan, the budget, forget all of that. You're thinking really big and bold and beautiful here. The second one is that nobody is allowed to say yes, but. Yes, but is the death of imaginative ideas. I'm sure all of you will have experienced putting forward ideas and someone will go, yeah, but it's too late, or yeah, but it's too expensive, or yeah, but we tried that and it didn't work. You know, yes, but is banned. You can only respond with yes and, which is something that I learned studying improv theatre, where someone suggests something. Hey, do you like my new phone? I haven't got a phone. You say yes, and I love the way that the way that it purrs or something, and then they build off that, and you build this whole scenario through trusting each other and accepting each other's yes and that they offer you. They went out for a walk for an hour. They came back with reams of what if questions, almost in a kind of altered state of consciousness. It was quite extraordinary. And I got them to write them all down. And then I said, imagine that end of the room is really, really urgent. That end of the room is not quite so urgent. Arrange your what if questions along that continuum. And then we gathered at the end with the most urgent ones and worked those ideas up. So by the end of the day, we had 6 ideas that could be implemented tomorrow in Patagonia that were really sufficiently radical for the times that we're in. So, but just before I finish, to say, if you want to find out anything else about what I do, there's some things there. The podcast that I do, there's a link to that which you might find interesting. So, I am hoping that I still have another 5 minutes. Dominic, am I right?
Yes, go ahead, Rob.
Good. Okay. So what I would love to do now is to invite you, based on what you've heard from what Freya said, from the work that you already do and your knowledge of the region, and the dreams, the longings that you have for how you would like the things to go. How might you translate those into what if questions? And maybe we'll just take a sort of a minute and a half or something just to reflect, maybe 2 minutes of in silence, just for you to reflect. You could have a look out the window, have a little walk around the room, and see what lands as a what if question, or more than one what if question that arise that you would like to share with everybody. So we'll just take a couple of minutes, and then I'll kind of, so yeah, have some reflective time. I'll call you back, and then we can use the chat to gather some what if questions. So see you in a couple of minutes. Maybe I might just invite you all back again, and we could just take a minute to just fill the chat with some what if questions. What are the things that bubbled up for you when you were thinking about that? What if we banned flushing toilets in favor of composting ones only? Thank you, Simon. I have to say, as somebody who lived with a composting toilet system for about 7 years, it was the best compost I ever made. What if everyone had space to grow their own veg? What if speed was less of a priority in life? What if there really was a pleasant cycle route? This is going past very fast. A pleasant cycle route for me to get to the Culm River after work? What if everyone believed in the climate crisis? It seems extraordinary in 2021 that there are still people who don't. What if everyone took 5 minutes to look at the sky? What if we could all grow more of our own food? What if we presumed no one in the future will have access to a car, a supermarket, electricity? What if we treated soil as the most precious resource we could ever have been blessed with? Absolutely. What if all houses in Belgium, where I have lived for 32 years, all houses have rainwater tanks so that it's used toilets, washing machine? What if everybody smiled? Thank you, Simon. What if the beavers returned again to the Culm? What if there was a string of pearls, wetlands all the way along the Culm floodplain? What if everyone made one small change that made life more sustainable? Thank you, Ian. What if everyone had lessons about the environment in the local environment? What if every child had a daily river school, time to play, immerse themselves in wildlife, and were free to spend time imagining? What if we all learned to value the water from our taps? What if we did away with so many strategies and policies and just went out and planted trees that would be the wood they could build their children's house from? Beautiful. Thank you, John. What if school children spend more time outdoors activities? What if there were picnic areas along the river for everyone to enjoy the space? What if we made the river Culm so clean that all the families could swim and play in it? What if we had off-grid renewable energy for every community? What if farmers trusted conservationists? That's a good question. What if streetlights were turned off after 11 and we could all see the stars? What if we all didn't buy anything for a whole year? What if there was a forest of blossom trees all along the roads to Exeter? What if we had a plan to adapt to climate change that was good enough and everyone knew it and had confidence? Absolutely. What if everybody helped sow and harvest their own food? What if you felt good about the fantastic biodiversity score on every shopping basket instead of worrying about the food miles? What if local politics and the media were also asking what if? Wow, thank you. You're good at this. This is great. And yeah, what's beautiful about this, I think, is that often I always find that this is a much better way to find common ground between people, actually, often than sort of coming in with a more sort of, I would get more kind of, yeah, with different approaches. And you know, in longer workshops, we can then take these questions and start to work them up into kind of first steps and where we would go from here. But that's my time, and that's something that we may be doing in subsequent workshops as part of this process. So thank you so much for doing that with me. What if everybody in the village brought their favorite food on a weekend and shared their story about it? Yeah, there's a beautiful, in America, in Pasadena, the transition group in Pasadena run a repair cafe once every month. And they say, you can come along, we can fix anything for free. We could fix your shoes, your curtains, your iPad, your toaster, whatever. There's one condition, which is that while it's being repaired, you sit in a chair opposite the person who's fixing it and you tell them a story about your life. I always wonder, you know, what are they really repairing in the Pasadena Repair Cafe? Anyway, with that, I'm going to hand back to Dominic, and thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Well, Rob, thank you so much. Thank you for that inspiring session, and thank you everybody for your glorious what ifs. It's a really rich seam of ideas and dreams and hopes, and we've got there. And what I'm delighted to say is that we have Rob joining us for 3 visioning workshops in May. I'm just going to share some dates with you. So do please come along. 11th of May, 13th of May, 19th of May. Each of the workshops will be running the same pattern, so you can come to one or all of them. Feel free to come to all of them. And those, we're going to be shaping our vision for the River Culm. We're going to be asking lots of what if questions, and we're going to be melding those visions together for the forum on the 17th of June. And again, that's going to be an unmissable event when we share where all of those workshops, visioning ideas have got to. And just also another note for the diary, a great session, Understanding Soils for the Culm, coming up on the 14th of July with Richard Smith from the Environment Agency, who is the soil guru for our area. And that's all on our website at connectingtheculm.com. And I just should say that local artist Richard Carman will be joining us with Rob Hopkins at those workshops. And Richard produced this vision, this image, which, you know, is a fascinating and rather bleak picture of the future. But he's going to be there as we take our what ifs and start to fill in this blank canvas on the right hand side of the screen. So yeah, these workshops look like being really a fascinating process to be part of. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen there and come back to everybody. And we've got some great questions also have arisen in the chat as we were going.
Yeah, there's lots of good questions for you, Rob. They all start, what if? I don't know if you've got any answers. No, I think we'll
probably realize I had to answer them all.
Yeah. How long have you got? There was a quick one from Lucy that was for you, Rob, which was what was the name of the artist that was drawn the biodiverse Leeds?
Yeah, I messaged her.
Oh, okay.
That. So he's called James Mackay. He's based at the University of Leeds, and he's one of the people. So in the book, in From What Is to What If, all of the interviews I did with everybody for that book even though they might have only appeared in the book as a sentence, the whole interviews are all on the website. So at robhopkins.net, you can search for James Mackay and you can find the whole conversation that we had.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, do you want to jump back, Dominic, to there's a few for
Yes.
for you, Freya.
Well, yes, Freya stimulated quite a few questions. The first one was from Daniel Hawford. With the increase of severe weather events, is the risk of strong winds likely to increase? Could we see hurricane force winds? And if so, how regularly could we expect these strong winds and what times of year?
Good question. So you may have heard about sort of tropical storms and that they're projected to increase. So that's quite a physically well understood process because of the gradients of temperature between the atmosphere and the ocean where storms form, and that's kind of a lot of storminess obviously is generated in those parts of the globe and then transported up through the sort of atmospheric passages that carry the weather across the Atlantic to us. So we do project an increase to winter storms, to the frequency of winter storms, but we don't see strong trends that have happened so far. And we also we know there's a lot of variability. So so the sort of the broad sort of evidence seems to suggest that there well could be increased storminess. But one of the things that makes it really difficult to project when you're talking about really high winds is, as you'll know, because very high winds are a very sort of localized phenomena. And when we do these climate modeling, we're working with a grid. And so each sort of grid square is kind of an average of the conditions for that area. But we know, obviously, with things like winds, you know, you could get very localized high winds. So when you're thinking about an area averaged, it's not really, it's harder to do. So basically our modeling of winds is one of the things that hopefully can improve with very high resolution modeling and downscaling, and sort of very heavy precipitation and flash flooding is again one of the things that we see. So that's why things like our, you know, we have these such big supercomputers to do these sort of simulations because it's very computationally expensive. So it's a bit of a stay tuned answer, I'm afraid. There's a lot of people working very hard to better understand the climate of the Atlantic, which is a very tricky, variable place. So obviously the better we understand the jet streams and how they're projected to change, then we can start to answer questions like this with a little bit more precision. But it isn't something you hear talked about a lot because there's quite a lot of uncertainty and it's quite a variable subject.
Thank you. And there's a kind of link question from Ian Townsend, who says, has the notion that we may suffer much colder winters due to melting polar ice caps causing the conveyor belt associated with the Gulf Stream to stop, has that idea been shelved?
So it's definitely not shelved. You'd probably hear kind of less about it than you might have done 20, 30 years ago when it kind of became this very famous idea. But a lot of the reason for this, without going into too much detail, because obviously you could tell I could talk about it all day, but those first projections, which projected this very steep decline, were basically taken with measurements that were only 5 points in time, years and years apart, because that's how the only way we got the measurements was to take a ship across the Atlantic. Whereas in the recent years, since 2004, we have buoys across the Atlantic which have been able to measure how this circulation is changing. And what we find is it's very, very variable. So what kind of looked like a trend had all this variability in between it. So the analysis of that does still suggest a slight trend. And obviously the science behind it, when we do what we call idealized experiments with putting lots of fresh water, can force a shutdown. But it is considered to be quite an unlikely event that it would completely shut down like this century, but that we do certainly expect it to maybe weaken slightly. And then that would cause, so our projections in Britain, we don't warm as much as other places might because of that kind of little bit of cooling effect. So it's actually sort of moderating the effects of climate change a little bit for us. That's more likely.
Okay, thank you. Some more questions for you, Freya. Have you looked at the risk through time of tipping points where either cows or potatoes are no longer sustainable in a particular region? And that's the thrust of that question.
Yeah, so no, not really. I don't think that the sort of patterns that we're seeing here compared to what other countries have may not make them, you know, sustainable at all, but just might mean that there needs to be more irrigation or other sort of mitigation. But it's kind of looking at analogues of countries, I think, that currently have the same climate now as what we expect to see in the future, which is a really good way of kind of assessing what different things will be able to thrive here.
Yeah, okay. And Delwyn Matthews has asked a sort of slightly linked question about, does the type of agriculture in the Culm need to change quickly? And this is kind of linked, also asking about whether you have a figure for how much greenhouse gases are produced by agriculture in the UK or in the Southwest, and whether, but those are sort of two slightly different questions there.
Yeah, so it's a little bit more a sort of DEFRA remit that would be of collecting that information. But I did just have a little quick look on the carbon, the Committee for Climate Change and Net Zero report, and there is a little figure there that shows that the carbon emissions from like beef cattle in the UK. So that might be of interest to you. So I'll just share that in the chat afterwards.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. And another one for you is whether there's any evidence that more traditional breeds of livestock are likely to be more resilient to these heat stress events than modern breeds, or is it the reverse?
So yeah, I can't really obviously answer this one, as I'm not an expert in cattle, but I suppose it kind of depends whether what you're talking about is sort of traditional British or traditional somewhere else, because obviously cattle which have kind of been developed in different parts of the world may well be more climate resilient because they've had to struggle with that, whereas I don't know personally, but I imagine obviously the development of breeds that we have here have been more focused on sort of yield and things like that, whereas in the Farmers Weekly article I was talking about earlier, there's a case study from a farmer in Cumbria with 200, he milks 287 cows twice a day, and he said the average pregnancy rate as well fell below his target of at least 25% last August during a hot spell on the farm, and so he's expecting that to really get worse as well. So but yeah, to go back to kind of how you deal with it, whether it's different cattle breeds or just more mitigation to provide them with a more comfortable environment, it's probably something that it hasn't really been a struggle up to this point because those conditions haven't really been seen, whereas obviously in other countries they have had to deal with these problems for a lot longer.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I wonder if there are any farmers in the audience who've got any personal experience of heat stress on their land, or know of people who have had to face this. Chip in if that's the case.
And while we're waiting for that as well, if feel free to interrupt me if anyone does want to reply. I was just going to go back to the question about agriculture and greenhouse gas emissions. That figure that Freya's going to share, I think, is for the UK-wide agriculture sector and broken up. Is that right, Freya? Yeah.
Yes.
I wondered if Emily Reed, if you're still on the line, if you had anything else to add on that from a Devon specific view, because I know that kind of sector by sector look is something which is factored into the Devon Climate Emergency work and the Devon Carbon Plan, which was launched in draft end of last year and has been consulted on. I don't know if you've got anything to add from the sort of Devon-wide perspective. I don't think we've got any figures that zoom right down to the Culm or really locally. But yeah, Emily, are you there? And is there anything in the Devon Carbon Plan that would be useful to add? She's gone to cook her dinner, maybe. But that might be something. I'll have a quick look at the Devon Carbon Plan, and we can share that or put it as part of the recording.
Okay. We got a question for Rob. Have any of the what ifs for anywhere become reality that you know of? That's
yeah. I mean, so yeah, lots of them. I mean, and that was that Liege, the story I told you from Liege was absolutely one of those, and the bank job one. I mean, I guess one of the ones that really comes to my mind, there's a concept that I'm really interested in at the moment, and I'm part of a group of people who are trying to who are kind of working on, is this idea of imagination infrastructure. How do you build an imagination infrastructure? If you want to support the population of a town or a city or an area to become more imaginative, what do you need to put in place in terms of skills, in terms of policy, in terms of whatever? And this idea of imagination infrastructure is fascinating. And I've been a director for about 13 years of a project here in Totnes called Atmos Totnes, which is the community-led redevelopment of an old milk factory in the centre of the town, the old Dairy Crest site. And we ran for that the most incredible consultation I've ever been part of anywhere in a town of 9,000 people. More than 4,500 people contributed their ideas. And it was really around this idea of this genuinely is a completely blank slate. Anything could happen here, absolutely anything. And as the directors of it, we recognize that our ideas are just 1/9,000th of this process, and our role is just to hold a process. And the way that was done and the way that was facilitated was just extraordinary. We're sadly, after then taking the whole thing through a referendum, and it's the most ambitious community-led regeneration development project in the country, we basically got sort of elbowed out of the way and gazumped by private developers a few months ago. So we're now back into campaigning mode, which is very, very tiresome. But still, it's like, for me, it was the most extraordinary. What if the community designed this place? What if the community then built this place? What if the community then owned this place? And what if it was built in such a way that after it was paid off, then it was just generating revenue for the town? What if we had a whole new model of how development happens? And it is going to happen. And we are campaigning very hard on that right now. So that's just one example. But the transition movement is full of stories of community-led projects that started with a good what if question.
And thank you, Rob. And actually, I think that our blueprint for the Culm is our own little bit of imagination infrastructure. It will be the place that we do this dreaming, and then we actually turn those dreams into what's the action plan that we need to make this a reality. And we've had a lovely comment from Gordon Guest in saying, what do we need to do along the River Culm? Plant more, plant different, change access footpath routes, encourage more local farm produce, and somebody else saying we should be shifting our dependency from cattle to more plant-based alternatives. So lots of really nice feedback from the chat there.
I would just love to mention, in addition to that, is one of the things that we have here in Totnes being Totnes, is that we have a milk round now, which is a plant-based milk milk round. So once a week I get reusable bottles like when I was a kid, with different kinds of oat milk delivered to the door using it's just fantastic. So there is a kind of new plant-based infrastructure that is building, and then I think will then in turn build demand for the kind of reimagined landscapes that are needed then to supply that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're drawing to the end, I think. Have we got any questions outstanding?
I think there was one about pests and diseases. So it's definitely something that people are, very concerned about, and how that's changing, because obviously, like any sort of biodiversity niche for a species, as we get warmer temperatures, wetter weather, that may allow species to hop over into the UK that we haven't previously experienced. So there are definitely people researching on that. I'm not going to comment on any specifics. It's not my area of interest, but not interested. It's very interesting. Not my area of expertise, but my colleague Debbie Hemming actually leads a team of people looking at this, and I know there's really a lot of interest and research currently going on as to how likely we think different species are, and I know actually that sector, vets and people working out, are also things like blue tongue, there is a concern that they'll become more likely.
Yeah.
Just on that as well, I wondered if John Burgess from the Forestry Commission had anything to add, because I don't know if that's something which is, climate risks which cause ecological shifts is something that's considered by Forestry Commission. Because a friend of mine was in Canada a couple of years ago and went to Jasper National Park, and they've had the pine beetle there has devastated this amazing wild wilderness and the forest, because the climate shifted just enough that they now get 2 gestation cycles in a single year instead of 1, so it's suddenly spreading. So I wonder, that's kind of a sort of secondary to the primary kind of changes in the weather, but I wonder if that's something which is, people have a steer on. John might have. Are you there, John? Or
yeah, I'm here. I'm listening. Yeah, one of the greatest worries for British forestry industry at the moment is the spruce bark beetle. It has absolutely destroyed productive forestry throughout the Czech Republic and Germany, and it is following the warming weather pattern. It's not so much the warmer summers, it's the fact that the winters, it's not the cooler winters that are killing the beetle off, which people think. It's just that it needs a certain temperature to breed in the summer. So as our summers get warmer, this beetle is moving north. And yeah, and if it carries on coming, it will be here in about 10 years' time, and it will devastate French forestry and then British forestry. Just to name one, there are plenty of others.
Thanks, John.
A sobering thought, yes. I think we're going to bring the event gently to an end now. Just wanted to mention, Andre has commented about event in Culm on the 26th of May, consultation event, so please do pick up on that if you get a chance and you're involved in that town. I also just want to run our poll as an end of event poll, just to maybe pick up any shifts in your feelings about these things. So please do, just before you leave, give us the answers on this question, and I'll just get to the right one. There we go. Please go ahead, and 2 questions are the same as the last one. And whilst you're doing that, I'll just see if there's any other comments going on. Quite a lot of information in the chat, some useful links to other projects. And what we'll be doing is we'll be circulating a recording of this event to you. We'll be posting it on the website, and we'll make sure that the chat is also included on the website post, so that you can pick up any links that were mentioned there. And yeah, we are at 83% voted. Your last chance to do so. It looks like quite a shift in people's position on both of those things, or both in a good way. So yeah, I'm going to end the poll there. And say thank you very, very much to our 2 speakers, Freya Garry and Rob Hopkins. Really appreciate your input and your inspiration, and thank you everybody for taking part, and we shall see you all again.